Welcome to Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Interests. If you can tell from the title of the episode, it's not heavy heart, but Mike Gordon, who's passed away, was a promoter of the National, a very active and dealer on the East Coast in the New Jersey area. Passed away, and Rich, I know you knew him better than I did.
Right.
The guy had a lot of knowledge. He had a lot of cards. He was well organized, but he wasn't in good health those last few years.
Well, we won't talk as much about the last few years. I didn't see him very often.
He had trouble breathing.
He had trouble. Yeah, he was a little too heavy.
Well, he was more than a little too heavy, and that's not everybody in the industry. But it can be a sedentary hobby, and you can be sitting around, and you can be on the road at the shows and eating less than optimally. So, but he was, I think he had a crusty exterior, but he was deep down a really kind of good guy.
He really was.
And he could be impatient at times, but it was over things where maybe a normal person would be impatient.
Yeah, I mean, he was like everybody else, like the rest of us, had a lot of good points and some points that you would want to say, not so much. But it was obvious how much he and his son Howie enjoyed the hobby.
Yeah. Do you know anybody from New Jersey that's not opinionated?
No.
Okay, just wondering.
We're all
like a statement, but I mean that's just the way it is.
We're all opinionated in New York, New Jersey.
Perhaps in the water.
I think it's because if you live like where we lived, and he lived like 45 minutes from me, but it's still a suburb of New York City. And New York City is such an aggressive place that if you don't stand up, you don't have your opinions, you'll get trampled in a lot of ways. So you almost have to be opinionated to survive in the New York area. And you have to be a little of that to survive as a dealer or a collector. And when Mike was, as you said, very well organized. Everything was priced exactly what we talked about earlier, that you went to his table, you knew what you were paying for what you got. And he tried to base price on condition, and he had, before he sold it.
He wasn't a big one for grading, I don't think.
No, but
I think he didn't grade hardly at all.
He didn't grade hardly at all, but, he would compare cards as he bought them if he thought
he predated.
But he predated grade. Yeah. But he'd also see what would upgrade his collection. Yeah. He had some beautiful cards back in the day. I used to drive with him to Albany because my house was actually on his way to Albany, and he had this big old car, so he could fit my stuff in the car with me, and it was about 10 minutes out of his way. He says, I'll get you. And so we'd load the car. Yeah. We'd drive up and back the same day. I'd always be exhausted and fall asleep about 8 o'clock that night. But it was really a cool thing. And, we could fit my stuff in the backseat of his car and me. And so I got to spend many hours in the car with him and Howie. We talk about things. Yeah. I remember one time we get up to Albany and we hear this wonderful world. It's 3 degrees outside with a wind chill of 30 below. It's like Albany in the wintertime is not exactly the world's warmest place. In case you wondered why I never moved back to New Jersey, 30 below wind chills will usually do that to you every time.
I always felt that Mike was really pretty smart.
He was very smart.
Because I know Howie's smart, his son, and he just, again, he didn't wear that on his sleeve or anything, but you could tell he was a bright guy.
And one of my favorite Mike Gordon stories has nothing to do with baseball cards. And in some ways, it's kind of sad. It's kind of predates why he had the weight problem he had. But he was going to be drafted, or he was eligible to be drafted, and he was close to the borderline on weight. Oh. So every day he would go to a place called Jan's, which happened to be about 5 minutes from where I grew up. And it was an ice cream parlor. And every day he'd order a banana split.
Oh, Rich, I know you're not making this up because your stories are legit, but kids, even adults, do not, just what you're about to hear, just don't do it.
But he put on enough weight eating the banana split every day where he avoided military service.
That hurts. And I actually did not do that. I actually wound up serving in the Army. That's another story. But I didn't know I had an ice cream banana split option.
But you probably weren't close to the weight. Weren't close to the weight borderline either.
Some lead time.
I want to hear about I never knew you were in the Army. I want to hear about that story someday.
Lieutenant Beckett. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll have to talk about that in a future episode. Yeah. But that caused his weight problem. So it's,
wow.
So that's because he never was able to shake the weight he added from that. So
yeah, well, I told you some of my favorite shows were in the New York, in that area, and he was a mainstay.
And what Mike did, and I was part of the crew, is Mike would get a group of tables at a Gloria Rothstein show, and Gloria would probably discount him. Let's say it was 20 tables, and then he'd charge us whatever he charged us, and his money, basically his 2 tables or 3 tables would then become free, which is perfectly fine if you want to lay out that much money, and then take the risk of not everybody showing up. hey, that's something worth doing. But to me, that was a great business model.
I always thought that he was a careful business guy.
He was,
Is that true?
Yes and no. He was careful, but every once in a while he would be uncareful. And that's probably not a word, but in 1989, he ordered 350 cases of 89 Fleer factory sets.
Oh.
Because that was the only way you could get a lot of Fleers in 89.
Yeah.
He ended up the next year actually doing well because Griffey exploded. He actually doubled his money 1 year later. But what I would have done, especially with all the stores that were extant in New Jersey at the time,
goodness.
I would have just said, okay, I'm paying $13.50 each, $16 to you until I get mine for free. He was less of a wholesaler of those.
So you think he held on?
As I said, he got lucky on those that Griffey exploded the next year and he could get 25 wholesale. But if Griffey didn't, he wouldn't have had.
Yeah. Well, you got to take a risk sometimes, and it takes money to make money sometimes. But again, in some of the years, this industry, it seemed like whatever you bought would be immediately saleable at a profit, and other sets not so much. But
and there were interesting, sometimes weird things like 85 Donruss highlights exploded. So everybody thought 86 Donruss, and Mike did not invest in those, but 86 Donruss highlights would explode. Oh, they exploded in the wrong direction.
But wasn't he more of a vintage dealer at the shows?
He was a vintage dealer at the shows.
So what was this?
This was when he had his store.
Okay.
You have a store. You need the new sets in the store.
Right.
Especially in the 80s and the 90s. You need.
And you were saying that as he was getting in bad health, and this may apply to some other people, but as his health was declining, he tried to divest of some of his stock because he wasn't able to go to the shows anymore. And so that's a kind thing to do to your heirs, to not dump a ton of cards on them, literally multiple tons perhaps, but to divest in an orderly fashion.
Well, if Howie wanted to stay in the business, at least Howie would have known what to do.
But Howie would not be encumbered with the huge volume.
Right.
Howie is a smart young man himself.
Howie's a successful lawyer.
What he wants. He wants some of it, perhaps not all of it, though.
Right, but through a mutual friend, he put his cards into one of the larger auction houses, and basically was able to sell his collection for very good money. And we were talking about this was recently somebody pointed out, why is Bob Gibson, who's now 83, 84 years old, selling his personal memorabilia? And Gibson's response was something to the effect of, I have X number of grandchildren. I take in this much money. I'll split it between the grandchildren. They can pay for college. They can do what they want. And they don't have to deal with what are we going to do with dad's stuff or grandpa's.
Well, especially he has terminal illness, right?
That's Lou Brock that's actually very sick.
But Gibson just had something.
Gibson had something, but Brock's is more serious.
Okay. But at any rate, the whole point is when somebody passes away, there's just this chaotic period afterwards. If you're the heirs or the executor, the last thing you want to worry about is some of these things that have a value that's not fully perceived by everybody. I mean, in sports collectibles, somebody might think there's the trash and treasure thing. His trophies are not trash, but even then, knowing where to place that to get fair value is.
And I think that's one of the smartest things people.
I like that. And
I actually,
and not even for just famous people, for anybody, and not even just for sports collectibles. If you're declining, and if Bob Gibson, I think, is 84.
He's 83, 84. Yeah.
So I mean, basically, he's in a situation where, it's not just how many more years do I have left, but how many quality years do I have left? And to begin that orderly process, that's good. So Mike Gordon did that. Again, like I said, I think he made a lot more right decisions than wrong.
Yes.
The ice cream thing notwithstanding, but he was a mainstay at the shows and was. I remember he sold a lot of our magazines.
He was one of our biggest, biggest sellers, and he sold the magazines. It's not like he was distributing them to other dealers. I remember there was some show trip I had to bring 200 baseballs for him to sell.
Yeah,
and I had to figure out how to get the 200 done, and we figured it out. And so he sold. In fact,
especially in those early days. I mean, there were dealers out there that didn't want the magazine to be out there because it would, hinder their sales. They thought. I think that's wrong, but so not everybody carried it. Mike faithfully carried it, and he'd have a big stack.
Yeah, and as I said, and he'd sell most of them, and he had a price point that he could discount them to.
Right.
Because he was getting enough where he was still making good profit.
We had quantity pricing, but he was able to take advantage of that. Again, like I said, it seemed like it's like he did the math. It's like he had a little bit of an accounting background or something to where he was savvy about those things. But
and on a happier story, Howie's favorite player growing up was Dave Kingman. Because one of the first games they went to his father and son, Dave Kingman hit 3 homers.
All right, and struck out.
Probably struck out the other 3 times, yes. But Could you imagine if somebody like Pete Rose had hit 3 homers in that game instead of Dave Kingman? Your personal collection wouldn't have been Dave Kingman.
It would be vast.
It would be Pete Rose, or, something like
still
that.
Be going, yeah. But,
well, Kingman still shows up in some sets nowadays.
Yeah, no, I saw it. That was, Dave Kingman is the modern day player.
He is. He's
feast or famine.
He's one of the first.
Hit it out or go sit down.
3 true outcome players, what they call nowadays.
Yeah.
Some of the people call it 2 true outcomes, but it's 2 or 3.
Actually, you don't even need to have a shift. You can just kind of sit down.
Yeah.
He's either a strikeout.
He's either strikeout homer or
I don't think he walked that much. And he had an uppercut. He had a big time uppercut, I think. Yeah.
Nowadays they call that launch angle. And I told the story of our mutual friend Paul Rogers, who loves the 50 Phillies.
Whiz Kids.
And he wrote another book on them recently.
Yeah.
And he talks about Jim Constanti. And Jim Constanti's pitching advisor was an undertaker who was a bowler. And whenever Constanti would get off, the undertaker would look and say, "You're not spinning the curveball enough." They knew about spin rate in 1950. They just didn't call it spin rate. Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
Well, Jim, thank you for the opportunity to share some stories about Mike.
We miss Mike Gordon again. He was larger than life in every respect, in a good way. And, we're sad for losing him. And I know the family is sad about that too. Again, he was not only a national dealer, but actually was one of the promoters of the 84 National.
And probably the key promoter, actually, of the 84 National.
Well, he was a solid guy. So we miss him. Again, thanks, Rich, for your time.
Thanks,
listeners. Oh, guess who forgot to talk about the sponsors?
Jim Hackett. Let's mention them.
Let's not make that mistake. Let's do it in reverse order. Upper Deck, we love you. Tops, we love you. Panini, we love you. Heritage Auctions.
We love buying from you.
Auctions. Yeah, I've done that recently. Burbank Sports Cards, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, ComC, which Rich does not let us forget.
But I work there, yes.
And I enjoy using their service. And Beckett Media, where actually we met before those days. But,
I call it the apocryphal meeting on the softball field of Parsippany, New Jersey.
Which I think it was 5 years before, but that's okay.
I like my apocryphal meeting story.
Fair enough. Okay, well, thanks, Rich, and thanks, everybody. We'll be back in another day or two with another episode. Thanks.
Is doing